Hi, folks. My name's Jarrett Myers. I'm going to be chairing this meeting, and a very warm welcome to everyone. We're joined by three fantastic speakers on the topic of emerging technology. Um, we have Jamie Boyd, who's the Chief Digital Officer of the Government of British Columbia. She also served as the Director of Open Government in the federal government of Canada. We also have Ott Velsberg. Ott is the Chief Data Officer for the Estonian government. He is also a PhD researcher who focuses on information systems in the public sector. And we have Jacqueline Liu. Jacqueline works with and leads Helpful Places, a coalition to implement and improve the way that open source system to people communication is being undertaken. She's also the data lead at the Mozilla Foundation and was the inaugural director of data analytics at the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. So I think the topic that we're focused on today around emerging technology is one that's very, very important to improving the quality and efficiency of public services, whether it's frontline services or core government services, but one that's not without its potential pitfalls, risks, and challenges. And so the speakers today will be talking us through both the challenges and the opportunities associated with emerging technology. The plan is to have each speaker provide a brief introduction to the topic, and then there'll be an opportunity for discussion and dialogue. And what I would ask folks to do is to feel free to post any questions into the chat, and we'll look to answer as many of those as possible. And also just to kind of support the facilitation and engagement of this session, make it as interactive as possible. If anyone is interested in introducing themselves in the chat function, we'd very much welcome that. So to kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, and if you want to give us your opening remarks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Jarrett, and hi to everybody across Canada. I'm joining you today from the Sunshine Coast in beautiful British Columbia, specifically the traditional territory of the Slaman-speaking peoples, today known as the Klahoose, Hamalko, and Tla'amin nations. So our topic today is emerging technology, and particularly its application in the public sector. I'm going to admit right from the start that I have a pretty profound bias when it comes to discussing this. I'm a practitioner. I work with governments, and I'm very excited to be providing services using technology. And I think that this topic is really important for at least two reasons. The first is, in a post-pandemic world, in our new normal and all of that, today, you're digital in providing government services, or you're largely irrelevant, at least for that service delivery side of things. Digital government is about providing great services to the people we serve and having the discipline of creating systems and a culture around the use of those new tools that's conducive to the success and sustainability of the use of the tools. The second reason why I think this is a really important topic is because digital still incites quite a bit of consternation. The novelist Arthur Clarke has this wonderful quote, and it's that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And magic is not really something that inspires a lot of trust in government. And so it's really important for us in government to be somewhat rigorous in the way that we adopt these new tools. And we have these imperatives that go beyond those of the private sector around things like explainability. So in terms of just these brief opening remarks, Jarrett suggested that we might want to reflect on things like, what is emerging technology? Why does it matter? How should governments be using it? What are the barriers? That sort of thing. And so I'm going to focus on what I think it is and provide a couple of examples, and then we can get into the barriers and all that sort of thing and with the other panelists and the broader conversation. So for me, what is emerging technology in government? Well, there are at least two kinds of emerging technology. The first is tools that allow us to do more or less what we were going to do anyway, but in a more effective manner. And the second one is net new functionality. So these new tools just materially change the nature of the service delivery or the public function. So in that first category, it's essentially, we were going to do these things anyway as government entities, but we're now able to do it more effectively. So a CRM or an integrated identity management system, these are things that we were going to do anyway. It just might have been, using Excel rather than a more sophisticated tool. We were going to issue an identity card of some sort to validate a person's identity, but perhaps that wasn't going to be as well integrated as it might be now. So a couple of examples of what this might look like in government. One that I particularly like is out of the government of British Columbia's Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Relief. There are some great examples around the use of robotic process automation, so RPA. This allows the ministry to essentially do the reconciliation between disparate databases and data sets that would have been done manually before. So it's not like that data wasn't being managed in the absence of RPA, right? But given this new automation, it creates a lot of efficiencies and allows those officials in the ministry to do things that only humans can do and really free up their time to focus on doing things like social work that are really high touch. So that would be an example of same but better. Another example might be in BC, in our Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources, we have blockchain-based solutions for improving the regulatory process. There was always going to be a permitting process. There was always going to be, some sort of validation that the right permits are in place. But now there are opportunities around transparency and trust, really. Same thing goes for different tools that allow us to generate code more quickly or more effectively. I know when GPT-3 started getting a lot of exciting coverage in the media, everybody was saying, oh, wow, automated code generation. Well, yes, that could create good efficiencies, but those lines of code were going to get written anyway. We're just doing it perhaps in a faster, more cost-effective manner. Mm-hmm. So that's the same, but better or faster, more efficient, better for the taxpayer, all that sort of thing. The other category of emerging tech in my mind is this net new functionality, where what we're able to do with the technology is so vastly improved or so scalable that it is materially different, right? And so an example of that sort of thing would be advanced data analytics to predict wildfires. Here in BC, obviously, we have a lot of concern around the management and response to wildfires. Our province is currently burning. And so it's not like there wasn't prediction before, but it was sort of more like a kitchen recipe rather than a commercial recipe. And so we're able to systematize those things. Same goes with the use of self-sovereign identity for things like a corporate registry. There was a corporate registry before, but on the basis of self-sovereign identity, you could imagine a version of the world where a corporate entity is able to autonomously manage different pieces of information and provide different sort of trusted relationships. Same goes for connectivity. As you get new tools like really, fiber all over the place, or you're getting Starlink, we're able to connect with people in a way that we weren't able to before. So that's from where I sit as a practitioner. There are sort of these two categories of emerging technology. The first, what we were going to do before, but we're going to be able to do it more effectively now. And the second, which is that net new functionality. And these two categories of emerging tech could be applied to our internal processes, like back office data reconciliation, could be in direct service delivery, could be broadly enabling functions. It could be applied in a number of different ways. And all of these things matter massively because they enable greater service delivery, they enable effectiveness, they enable explainability and auditability in really exciting sorts of ways. I'm going to pause there because I think I've hit my 5-minute mark, but I'm very excited to dig in a little bit further around how government should be making use of these tools. So back to you, Jarrett.
That's fantastic. That was a really great introduction and overview of some of the concepts I think we're going to dig into in a bit more detail over the next 50 minutes or so. So we're now going to move to Jackie, who's going to talk us through some of the challenges and opportunities with using emerging tech, specifically in engaging with not limited to, but also focused on engaging with the public. So Jackie, I'll hand it off to you.
Cool. Thank you for the great introduction. And yeah, my name is Jackie. I'm excited to be sharing in the context of this conversation around emerging technology and benefits and risks. I'm excited to be sharing a project called Digital Trust for Places and Routines, which is an open source project that I started while I was working here in Toronto for a private company called Sidewalk Labs, to actually try to imagine how there can be better interfaces for digital systems and places for people. And this question of how the intersection or the interface between residents and community members and kind of emerging technologies, especially in the context of public space, was something that actually preceded my time at Sidewalk. When I was in the public sector at New York City parks, we were starting to pilot IoT in public spaces. We were starting to look at reusing existing data streams around fleet telemetry and mobile trace data, all in the context of improving service delivery for municipal parks. And so so this is something, the idea of putting up signs and providing information to the public around the use of these technologies is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I spent most of my time in the public sector, and Sidewalk Labs was my first private sector foray. And I was attracted to it, partly because it was in Toronto, which is where I'd grown up, but also because that project, the Quayside project here in Toronto at Sidewalk Labs, was the center of what had actually been kind of like a global conversation around the benefits and risks and concerns for emerging technology. So I'm going to kind of go ahead and share my screen. I just wanted to kind of do that sort of little preamble. So I think when I think about emerging technology, or like what is emerging technology, I think less about new technologies, but more about the fact that the technology is actually already here, but it's invisible. And so I kind of define emerging technology as technology that is not well understood by a broad segment of society. And why is this? What are some of the challenges here? What are some of my thoughts? Is that I think technology promises or has the potential to do things like make our roads safer for people, make our buildings greener, but the question is really the evergreen question, I think, around adopting emerging technologies, both in the public and in the private sector, is really like, is that technology living up to its promises, and how would people know? And the ability to know is kind of underlined by this like fundamental problem that, especially in the built environment, digital is kind of invisible, and there's very little transparency about what is being collected by whom and for what purposes. And so that basic information is kind of missing. And it's not that we don't have laws and regulations, right? Like in multiple jurisdictions, there are sort of regulations that extend privacy protection to the offline world, but these mechanisms for notification and accountability are either absent or inconsistent. And my thinking here, and the folks that I worked with on this project, is that people should be able to quickly understand how these technologies work and the purposes that they serve. But what we have now is kind of like a bunch of ad hoc approaches and a fragmented approach to communication. Whereas in contrast, in transportation, we have the universal symbol set. And doesn't matter which airport you go into anywhere in the world, you understand what that environment is doing for you. You understand how to navigate it. You understand how to use it. And we're like, basically, we feel there should be something similar for digital technology. And because without that transparency and without kind of advancing that legibility, I think this is the barrier that air quotes smart cities is coming up against, is that it's misunderstood, it feels risky, and I think it specifically not prevents the ability to have a broad conversation about what our spaces should sort of look like. and how we can have like a broader societal conversation around risks and potential benefits and the sorts of trade-offs that we might be willing to make as both like individuals and as of groups. And so the approach has been really, again, to sort of focus on communication. How do we focus on legibility and understanding? Because the world that we are now in is, you know, one where every pylon, bench, and segment has the terms of service and a privacy policy, but we haven't made that sort of accessible. And so I know I'm running out of time, but this is just a little bit about the process of how we drafted this open source standard, which is a dictionary of concepts for tech and data practices. It's a set of icons that express those concepts in a visual way. And I just kind of want to put this here as a prompt for everyone, which is that you know, imagine that you could come up to an intersection and be able to understand, you know, what is going on there in terms of the technologies that actually exist, that you understand the purpose for how it's been deployed. You can see kind of who's accountable, data types and data processing, and provide feedback. And so what might the world look like if we could actually have a specific conversation around how technology shows up in specific places, and discuss kind of what it's doing for that particular place and that community. And so when I think about what like leadership looks like, or what leadership might look like when we think about emerging tech, I think it's really about this, like, so a quote from Nayeli, which is like, how are we promoting this shift in this cultural awareness, which is necessary, not just, I think, in the public sector, but actually also in the private sector. We all have to kind of think about these trade-offs. And what does it mean? How do we invest in communication tools and public processes to imagine what else that might look like? So, and with that, I will turn things back and just, you know, pick it up from there.
That's great. Great. Thank you, Jackie. There's lots of interesting material to dive into in a bit more detail in a couple of minutes there. It's also an interesting segue into, we've got the Chief Data Officer for the government of Estonia. So I know what you've got some remarks prepared just by way of introduction, but there's also a number of themes I'm sure that you could pick up on. And I know one of the best article titles I had read was how Estonia became as in electronic Estonia. And so I often think about that whenever I'm talking to somebody who's from electronic Estonia. So I'll turn it over to you to give us your initial comments for the session.
Thank you, Jared. First of all, good evening to everyone, or afternoon or morning. So I guess a lot has already been said, but just for the conversation, I guess it's important to state what I mean when speaking about emerging technology. So I typically consider both new technology, but also continuing development of already existing technology. So typically the commonality between these various initiatives is new opportunities, but also challenges that arise related to particular technology. So if previously was mentioned new opportunities, but I would state that even using technologies that exist today, but haven't fully used, that's a really emerging technology for us to fully utilize what is already existing. And whether it is the lack of knowledge, practices, or governance that doesn't exist, or even the legal landscape supporting the use case. So there are various difficulties. But regardless of what an organization introduces, it is crucial to outline the strategic objective that is technology neutral for doing so. In Estonia, I believe it is crucial to make citizens' lives better, and we see that technology plays an important part in doing so. Mark Twain once said, if you want to change the future, you must change what you're doing in the present. And I truly believe that technology is a way to change how we operate right now. But as it's about sharing our practices, I guess I will jump straight to one of the topics that I'm most concerned about. It's introducing AI to the government. So in Estonia, when talking about AI, the overall strategic agenda is that the government should be all about zero bureaucracy. The government should be as lean as possible. It should work in the background. It should be proactive. So citizen should never ask the government for a specific service. The government should proactively offer them. Similarly, services should be invisible, as little as interaction as possible. And we should make smarter decisions, whether it is based on data or in real time. So these are the strategic objectives that when talking about new technology related to data, we want to outline to different stakeholders, whether it's ministries or agencies. And they typically have a really kind of a straight outline how it affects citizens, whether it is starting a business, retirement, startup school. We have an outline what we want to achieve as a whole government, and different technologies, for instance, let's say AI can support achieving that. And I will bring you some examples on how AI can support, for instance, unemployment and job search. So the idea is that all services work in the background, and now the question is how particular technologies can help achieve that. But introducing any new technology, then kind of the first things that we see, whether it is open data, data governance, AI, is about how we can simply explain people what the technology is about. In Estonia, we have brought this kind of a mythological creature, Krait, into the picture. And in old Estonian mythology, you gave few drops of blood to Krait, and Krait carried out different tasks. But you always had to be really careful, because if you weren't cautious, then Krait could hurt you. And we are bringing in the similar approach with the data science projects we carry out. You need to know what data you're using. You need to know the project scope and so forward. Otherwise, the project can go really bad, really fast. And it's all about building base capacity. In 2018, when I started our AI strategy for the government, then we only had a couple of AI use cases. And early on, it was about testing out. Let's test out small, validate whether AI can actually be applied in the government. And we should support uptake across all different sectors. Let's get the feedback and then decide how we can move forward. And based on this feedback, today we have over 80 different solutions already in place, with many more underway. We have used AI or actually remote sensing to understand whether farmers cut the hay. Related to one of the proactive services, we are identifying people's long-term unemployment risk and also providing them concrete recommendations. So the overall aspect that the government should be as lean as possible and proactive, this very system supports that goal of us. Or even understanding what different roads are more prone to traffic accidents and how to make them safer. So a little bit about the lessons learned. So I mentioned shortly that the idea was, let's start out small. Let's test out the ideas. We supported projects by allowing more iterative processes. So projects could actually fail. Before that, there was, if a government agency asked funding from the ministry and they didn't deliver their results, then they were out of the game. They had to pay everything back. We gave them a little bit flexibility. So test out the hypothesis. You can actually change during the project what you're working towards. And if it doesn't work out, it was still great lesson learned. And I think this was one of the key issues, that we love to brag about things that work, but we often don't talk about the projects that fail. And again, just to enhance and kind of get everyone to talk about their projects, their failures, we have initiated different workshops where every month people come up and talk about the projects, whether it failed or not. But just to run through some of them, as I'm talking about the data science project, it is important to understand before the project whether you have access to the data, whether the necessary data is actually available. You need to ensure data quality and provide metadata. And this applies to the whole government. You should not only think in terms of your own kind of organization, but your organization data actually contributes to all the projects that are carried out in the government. Reusability and open source works. We wouldn't be where we are if we wouldn't share what we have done openly in the government code repository. So much of the projects that we carry out, they are open source. And this has been one of the strategic agenda for us from the beginning. And in the end, among other things, keep it short and simple. Test out whether your idea has actually any value at all. And if it does, then move forward to the development. Happy to discuss all the other things later as well.
That's great. Thanks, Odd. Again, a lot of interesting material to dig into there. So the next part of this meeting agenda is to give the speakers an opportunity to ask each other a question or two. And maybe just to get things going, I'll just ask Jackie a question regarding the experience with Sidewalk Labs. And I think, it's always a good signal if the initiative you're working on becomes a case study in the Harvard Business School. So it suggests that there's some degree of innovation or something interesting going on there. And I'd just be interested in any thoughts you have around things that could have been done differently to optimize the impact that Sidewalk Labs could have had. And maybe the answer to the question lies in the initiative that you were presenting, the DTPR. Maybe that's the direct result of what may have been done differently to increase impact. But just interested in any thoughts on that, and then we'll get you to ask one of the other speakers a question of your choosing. And looks like you're on mute, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto, entered the public discourse when there was a sea change in, I think, at least in North America, a sentiment towards the role of technology and the role of private vendors and technology companies in particular. I do think that that was an important element of kind of what I think in the context of when you think about when the Waterfront Toronto issued the RFP for the master innovation plan, was a very different sort of environment, and there was sense of sentiment around technology than when 2 years later the actual draft innovation plan was actually delivered. So I think that's definitely one, is just the larger sentiment around trust and trust of government, trust of systems really changed. And I think that even though there was a lot of conversation around, what does better data governance look like? Let's get really clear on these different objectives. It was hard for individuals and for I think person on the street to be just kind of well, hang on, how does this actually impact me? I get that there's this vague notion of reduced greenhouse gas emissions and maybe less traffic, and it might be easier to get around, but it's hard for me to think about what this would look like and whether and how we would kind of move through a neighborhood or be affected slightly differently. So you're right that the DTPR project was an attempt to be just okay, a governance proposal. It doesn't actually address all of the questions, and certainly it was hard, I think, in the specific vendor tripartite government public discourse and sentiment context to navigate a path sort of through that. But yeah, I think that it's like, this is where I think I would take a page from what Ott said, which is like, how can you iterate quickly and how can you demonstrate? Because I think even though there was, you know, being at Sidewalk, we had hoped to be able to iterate and demonstrate and do actual proof of concepts on the ground to be able to demonstrate what this could look like and get real feedback. The broader sort of discourse around the project actually really prevented us from being able to do so. And so I think that just was like a fundamental challenge when thinking about how do you introduce and bring in place these like emerging technologies. There's a lot to be said just for actual piloting and actual trying. And I would just say that that's something to really think about how we would sort of navigate that the next time round and set those expectations across the board that piloting and trial and error is likely going to have to be part of the process. So, you know, that no single sector, no single organization actually has all of the answers. It's a dialogue. And so that's kind of where I would be in that one. And that would be my own opinion on kind of what was happening there. I mean, I think a question that I have, it would be for Ott. I'm really interested to hear more about it's really exciting to hear about the vision for AI in government in Estonia. I was kind of reflecting on your slide where you said, you know, we're looking, we hold as principles, you know, zero bureaucracy, invisible personalized services, you know, proactive government. And I think my question I'd love for you to elaborate on is like, how does exactly this question of public discussion or public awareness of exactly the use and application of those technologies, what does that look like, you know, in Estonia? You know, what can we learn from obviously like many of the successes? And, you know, yeah, so I'd just love to, you know, flip that over to you and be like, and then ask that question. So thanks.
Thanks. So regarding public discussion on both the proactive government and AI, there is actually, to be honest, very little public discussion. So outside the government, we tested out people's sentiment a few years ago. So what do they actually think about what we are working towards? And the sentiment was basically the following. 1/3 said that they are really concerned about AI taking their job, that their own kind of will to decide over things is gone and the government then will decide over all matters. 1/3 said that this is the best thing that has come after sliced bread, that this is the most welcomed movement. It will help people to spend time more on things that actually matter and so on. And this is the final third was kind of the typical Estonian attitude. We don't really care about what you talk about. If you name it AI or data analytics or CRIT, we don't really care as long as the government functions. So regarding public, there wasn't actually not that much discussions or hasn't been yet. In the government, this is another thing. And we have a lot of difficulty sometimes pushing through our agenda, but this is about funding, for instance. We evaluate projects. Today we are talking about emerging technologies, but I will just add innovation as well. So every project that we fund, they have key metrics related to innovation and how they support. So you need to, from those 6 points, you need to get at least 2. Otherwise, the project will not get funded. And 2 of them is AI. The second one is proactive government. We also have cloud, for instance, cybersecurity, and so on. So out of those 6, you need to have at least 2. Otherwise, you don't get funded. So this is a gentle push in all aspects to think a little bit ahead we don't say that we are not investing any government money to projects that are not super innovative, but you need to always keep in mind on what is possible and think a little bit ahead. So this is just my quick reflection. And I guess I have one question as well. So I have spoken myself, but just to everyone, what is your kind of recommendation on how to best test ideas? So we have been talking a lot about testing ideas. Let's test hypotheses. What's the best way to do that, in your opinion? Amy, do you want to take first?
Yeah, great question. I'm a big believer in taking agile approaches, and so really iterating in a responsible way. And that's something that is often quite challenging for government because it doesn't always fit particularly well with our various cultures and that sort of thing, you know. And so I think it's really useful to create sandbox environments where you can say, I'm going to test up to this point, and I'm going to really be very rigorous about learning. And I'm going to learn as a community. So in the case of the government of BC, we're big fans of open source. If you go onto the government of BC's GitHub, you'll see over 1,000 repos. That's very unusual, at least at the subnational level, particularly in North America. And so we work in the open, and we really go out of our way to learn as things happen. You know, for the past 2 years or so, I've been doing a monthly call where we get fans of digital government to come and share lessons along the way. And, you know, where did we fail? What did we learn? And that allows us and sort of my broader team to really come up with effective things like guardrails. And so that we can be responsible. When I think of the barriers to the adoption of emerging technology, I see really sort of 4 categories of barriers. The first one is around the business case. Like sometimes, you know, the shiny, cool toy doesn't necessarily help us deliver on the mandate of government. So, you know, don't use it just because it's cool and new, right? So there's the business case, and I would include things like social license in there. There's capacity. We don't always have a particular expert available, or if we're able to access those experts, sometimes we have to do it through not the best vendor engagements, where there is a huge degree of reliance, right? And, you know, so then there's the absence of guardrails, there's the cultural openness. So there are all these barriers. So I really do believe that there's a lot of opportunity associated with creating these sandboxes, being very open about learning along the way, documenting those lessons, and then as you come up with the lessons, creating guardrails to make sure that you don't go down the wrong path as you scale. So designing with scalability in mind. It's interesting, you were talking about the investment process in Estonia and how you have to have certain criteria that are met before you proceed. That's very similar in our government. And there's, I think, a cultural shift that comes with that. And it's a shift away from having projects, these things that we build and then we hope for the best, and products, where there is operating fund and sort of ongoing investment and sustainability. I would say that in the case of emerging technology, it is more important than ever that we treat these initiatives as products that are not just built and then left to sort of fester or degrade or whatever. We need to build these things with that eye to sustainability. So you don't just go and test and then say, okay, we're done, that's good enough, off we go. I think we need to be putting agile teams in place to actually be successful in the delivery of these tools. I have a question for you, Ott, but Jackie, I think I'd love to hear your response to Ott's question.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. You know, how do we best test ideas? Is like, you just kind of have to get out there. But I think I was just reflecting, I was like, you know, my experience in the public sector was in the municipal level and definitely in a different context. It was in New York City, but similar challenges around giant, massive bureaucracies, the hierarchical organizations, you know, the like unions were definitely, I would say, you know, a thing as we started to think about how digital technology can shift people's ways of working and how that can like make things be really sort of uncomfortable, I think, for folks. I think I would really resonate the starting small is necessary. And I think when I think about analytics and data, and even the possibility of new data streams coming into service delivery, I always kind of look at like, what is the existing business process like right now? What is it that you're doing, and map that out very specifically, and then to look at, is there a point in this process specifically where a new insight might help you make a different decision? So it's much more sort of surgical, and I think about like how you can bring and test and learn, so that you're not trying to shift the entire system at once, but you're just like, let's think about delivering a new type of insight right here so that you can have a better informed decision and think about that better outcome. And then from there, you can go, because I think that's where you also can start to think about, questions of, what might be sustainable? Does this stick in the long term? Because you're not also running this massive organizational change management process, like at the same time. I think that's a lot, but it is very different from the kind of current mindset, I think, of how public sector, at least in North America, has historically approached technology procurement. I really liked your framing, Jamie, about shifting from a project mindset to a product mindset. Like just the fact that you have to recognize that technology is kind of alive. You have to keep working with it. It's actually never done. Is not, I think when I think about the way technology projects are often funded in government, it's a big capital raise rather than part of operating budget. I think that changes the way you think about being able to test, learn, and deploy and try things out. So I'm sorry, that was a little long-winded.
So Jared, I assume you want to go to audience questions, but maybe as we do, just as we're sort of figuring out which ones to go, I do have a quick question for Ott.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to ask you about talent. So in terms of the various barriers that we come across, one that I think is particularly challenging is that we do have in many of our governments, we have a huge degree of reliance on our vendors. In our case, in the government of BC, we outsource about 80% of our IMIT spend, which I think is pretty typical for many of our governments. And so when we talk about new technologies, and not even that new, like I'm talking about things like cloud, there's often a bit of a resistance. It's like, okay, yeah, we want that. We want the functionality. We want the savings. We want all that. But we don't have the talent in-house. And it's almost like a chicken and egg problem where it's like, okay, I can't adopt this new technology because I don't have the skills, but I can't build capacity in-house if I don't have access to the technology. So I'm really curious, what has Estonia done about that?
Okay, so that's a great question, and that's a really difficult problem. So we have a similar situation whereby I can say we almost completely rely on vendors outside. So what we have done, or I'm going to talk specifically on my area. So for instance, let's take our central government. It's around 26,000 people. And within the last few years, we carried out, first of all, AI basic learnings to almost 1/4 of them. So the idea is really to get to the business side. And this brings into how we initiate projects. I'm a true believer that the technical side must have the knowledge as well, but our focus is often more tilted towards the business side. And we don't start by just talking about, for instance, open data or data governance or data analytics or but understanding the business needs. So what are the current problems that they face? We typically actually in the beginning mark down all the problems they have. Sometimes we end up with 200 different problems that the agency brings out that they are worried about. And then we look into how we can solve them. Perhaps data science is one way to do that. Sometimes it is actually changing the way they operate altogether. So it's not about technology at all. So I think this is kind of a key takeaway for myself and the team, that we don't need to push the technology in. Technology comes when we can provide a solution, and this is just one way we have tried to do. And if you have those small kind of POCs or MVPs that have worked out, they typically do the talking themselves. So if people see that something has worked, then they are more eager to adopt the technology itself. So perhaps I answered, but the question itself, there are problems always.
That's great. Yeah, and lots of really great questions and dialogue around a number of topics there across the panel. So we do want to encourage folks to submit any questions. Obviously, we can only get to a small number in the time we have available here. But please do feel free to submit those over the chat. And I think one of the questions that's come up, thank you to Paul for asking that, and Paul Gaskin, and he's asking about dealing with change in communications for new products, and distinguishing between people who might be early adopters versus skeptics. And you know, I think this question could be asked about internally within government as a whole. So, you know, I imagine most of the people at this session, and certainly the speakers, are among the early adopters of technology and very pro, you know, where it makes sense, obviously, pro emerging technology. But there are many colleagues across our organizations who don't share that same passion. So we'd be interested in your thoughts around how we communicate, and I think Jackie used the term organizational change management, both from a internal to government as well as a public facing change management and communications. Jamie, did you want to kind of kick us off on that?
Sure, it's a wonderful question, and I think it really does speak to the importance of the approach that Ott was describing, of sort of taking that iterative approach. It's kind of interesting. Out of central government and the government of BC, we've come up with what we refer to as common components. They're sort of like the Tetris blocks of applications. So they're the various things that we expect that most digital teams will need. And we don't like building them multiple times. That's not good for the taxpayer. And so if you just if you Google BC common components, you'll see a list of sort of our designated common components that we've worked to mature. And it's, I think, a really interesting case study of how we can build familiarity or comfort with different approaches to delivering digital services. And a great example of one that was in there is our friends over at the Canadian Digital Service kept on talking about Notify. We're like, Notify, what is this? You know, we notify British Columbians of things all the time. What's so special about this new service? So we poked around, and it ended up being a pretty fantastic open source tool. And so we set it up for the government of BC and had a couple of really great use cases, and it went really well. And so once we got it through things like our privacy impact assessment, our security and threat risk assessment, all that sort of thing, we were able to designate it as sort of a formally endorsed tool that our enterprise architecture group had gone through and said, yes, this is a great tool to use. And I think that sometimes that sort of stamp, being like, we vetted this is a good tool to use, go ahead, can really help. And then you collect stats on it and sort of tell the story. We had a similar kind of experience with our services card. So for those of you who don't live in BC, BC has some pretty fantastic identity solutions. So you get your BC services card. We were the first jurisdiction in North America to take our driver's license and our health identity card and create a single piece of identity. And then you can go on there, you go into the App Store, download the app, the BC Services Card app, scan the barcode. You can then FaceTime with a government official to activate your app. And then you can go in and access all sorts of interesting services. So I got my second vaccine about a month ago. I was all excited to be vaccinated, and within about 4 hours, I went into my app and I was able to see my digital proof of vaccination in the application, which is, pretty fantastic. But that sort of thing, using FaceTime type service to do two-factor authentication, using the BC Services app to then provide a sort of a gateway to other services. All of that kind of seems a little bit scary to folks, right? But now that it's functioning and people can go in there and I have this great service experience, I can go and see my vaccine in a few hours. The backlog of different parts of government that want to gain access to that is huge. So I think it's kind of like a proof is in the pudding kind of situation. You demonstrate the value, you show, okay, this is better, or it's cheaper, or it's more inclusive, it's easier to explain. It comes down to a basic business case type thing. And then having that rigor of going and really making sure that we are documenting the lessons, that we are a learning organization, and that we aren't learning the lessons 20 times for the 20 ministries across government. Let's be smarter than that. Let's get over these silos and actually share the lessons, not only within our governments, but between them through events like this. So for me, it's really the communications is just, you have to do it. You have to talk about what you're doing. You have to assess what you're doing. You have to share the lessons and bring the community along on the ride.
That's great. And a couple of good examples there, learning from other governments, other jurisdictions, as well as internally prioritizing that. Another question that's come up, maybe Jacqueline, this one might be for you. Thank you to Derek Alton for asking it, and to Sarah Hoy for upvoting it. So far it's the only upvoted question, so I figured that should be next. So he's asking about the role of government versus the role of the private sector, and how we think that they could work more effectively together. I think as Ott mentioned, we discussed a little bit about the heavy reliance on private sector vendors, and particularly given your experience with Sidewalk Labs and the new initiative you're working on. Interested in any comments you have around the role of government and the role of private sector in emerging technology.
Yeah, I think like at a top level, the public sector, as representatives of the people, should be identifying the outcomes that the technology should be serving, and then not just identifying those outcomes in a silo, but ensuring that there are processes by which the public can understand exactly how that technology works and be able to provide feedback, I think, and to be able to influence ideally how those technologies are utilized and showed up, or at the minimum, rather than being prescriptive, be able to say, well, these are the outcomes that we're sort of looking for. Where I think government plays an important role is also in helping articulate and look at the risks, and making sure that risks, not just to individuals, but also to groups, are sort of adequately considered, and that they are included in that dialogue. This is just not, I guess this is definitely not easy, having been on both sides of that fence, the private sector side and the public sector side. Making sure, I think the top level takeaway would be how can we help people not be surprised? It feels like a guiding principle for me. And then within those outcomes that are kind of defined by and helped set by the public sector and sort of guardrails within they operate, I think the private sector should be allowed to innovate and should be allowed to provide propose new ideas and new processes and new sorts of tools sort of within that. But it does require kind of a shift away from I want to buy that thing towards this is what the outcome I need to achieve, and this is the situational context that I'm operating in, and allowing the problem solving to happen from that point. And so I see Ott has his hands up, so I'm going to kind of punt it over to him. But I think that would be my kind of initial thoughts on that. So Ott.
Yes, so I just wanted to share, we also should have, from the public sector side, expectations towards private sector. And it shouldn't always be monetary. And why I'm stating that, so when carrying out those 80 projects, then we have discussed today that there is sometimes little competence and experience in the public sector, and it is easier to get that from the private sector side. So in Estonia, related to all AI projects, I have done that the private sector must contribute free of charge in the beginning and to think through the projects. There was hesitation before, but as we only fund projects that have really thought through, then if they don't help the different agencies, then they will never go to the tender. They will never get to the procurement. So it is really about supporting the public sector enough that they know what they are doing. And if they are mature enough, then they can go to procurement and the private sector can actually compete. Sometimes the companies that have supported the agencies, they don't win, but this is a normal part. So it is really about supporting each other. And I showed on the slides as well that cooperation between private sector and research institutions, this was actually crucial in what we have done. Whether it is open data, whether it is data governance, AI, there must be collaboration going on. And it is not always just monetary.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Ott. Just in the last minute or so, we have just for each of the speakers, just any kind of final concluding remarks or observations, potentially what you think the future holds for emerging technology. Interested in any kind of final comments you have. We've got about a minute for each of the speakers, so maybe Ott, just because you've got the floor, you wanted to kick us off there.
Yeah, so I think the technology itself helps us to really rebrand what the government is all around. So blur the lines between the public sector and private sector, actually start talking about integrated public services. So for instance, let's take getting into a traffic accident. Why should it end with the police or emergency unit arriving? It should end when you get your car fixed. So really rethink how the government functions. We should no longer talk about websites and so on. You can take your phone and talk to the government, use any public service whatsoever. So rethink the government. I think that's what the technology itself allows us to do.
I like that a lot. Jamie, did you want to give us your concluding remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. The opportunities here are massive. Government exists to serve people, and here we have an unprecedented set of tools to provide services. We have an imperative as public interest technologists to use these tools in responsible ways. There's a great Drucker quote that I'll read. The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic. And so that's sort of my closing thought. As we have greater access to these new tools, that's wonderful, but we do need to be thoughtful about how we adopt them, right? We need to have that eye to sustainability, making sure that there is a good business case, that there is a clear product owner, that we adopt these things responsibly in an agile way that is learning, that's based on clear expectations. We have to adopt them in a way that's inclusive. So adopting them at the speed of trust, getting community buy-in, building with the community that we're serving, using open source, empowering people through the use of technology. So that would be really my parting thought. What a wonderful opportunity for all of us on the call today to access these new tools, but let's access them in a way that is sustainable, responsible, and inclusive.
Excellent. And Jackie, the last word or second last word goes to you.
The last word. So I am also technology sort of optimist. I think that technology has a potential to improve the way like our places and our routines work, and like it should give you superpowers is the way I kind of think about technology. And I think the question we have before us is like, how can we equip people to be able to make their own decisions and come to their own conclusions about the benefits and the risks, and recognize that that is actually not sort of black and white or kind of like even across people. It's incredibly contextual to a person, their context, their situation. And so really it's like, how do you, I've just kind of urge is like, as we think about trying to reap the benefits of this, how do we actually empower people to be part of that conversation, and so that we can sort of move towards those better outcomes that we're all looking for.
That's great. And you know, when we were talking about superpowers, that's always a fantastic way to end. So I did want to say thank you again to all of our excellent speakers. This was a wide-ranging conversation, lots of practical elements to it, and really appreciate you sharing your perspectives and giving us, I think, all not only something to think about, but also to act upon. So thank you, and thank you to all of the folks who were able to introduce themselves and ask all the great questions. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the IPAC conference.